Today he's talking about a book, which concerns all of us, I think, because it's an issue that we should be very concerned about, the lack of science in politics and in really in discussion in general about how our future is going to go. So this book, which is here, Shawn brought a few copies. If anybody's interested after the program and like to buy one and have him sign it, he'd be happy to do that for you. And I'm going to turn it over to Shawn. I know as a screenwriter, he has a lot of dialogue, so we want to give him the whole hour. Shawn, thanks so much for coming up.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. It's a beautiful day. I'm surprised you're not all outside.
We're leaving soon.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll get right into it because I know that I've only got a limited time and a lot of cool stuff to talk about. Whenever the people are well informed, Thomas Jefferson wrote, they can be trusted with their own democracy. And this was kind of the founding idea of American-style democracy. It was the reason why Jefferson was a big advocate for public education and for freedom of the press. By public education, you could build an informed citizenry, and with freedom of the press, the adults in that citizenry could remain informed and make good decisions in democracy. But what happens today, 236 years later, when science has exploded all around us and is really challenging us with some very complex issues? Can anybody tell me what those blue lines represent?
Airplane routes.
They look like airplane routes. This will be a clue right here. See that dark spot there? That's China. These are Facebook connections. China blocks Facebook. It's called the Great Firewall of China. And the reason that I use this image is because it illustrates how interconnected we all are now around the world because of the internet, because of science and technology. And not only are people socially connected, but scientists and engineers are connected around the world too. In fact, scientists no longer have any real geographic requirements, at least when it comes to working with one another. I'm in regular communication actually with scientists, climate scientists, all around the world. And this is having a profound impact on the acceleration of science and technology and the creation of new knowledge. Not only are there more scientists around the world doing more experiments, making more discoveries, but they are qualitatively improving their work, increasing in complexity, bringing in scientists from other parts of the world and other disciplines that they really didn't have access to before to get new input. So you have a lot of overlap in different types of disciplines now, and this qualitative difference combined with a quantitative difference is exploding the amount of knowledge that we have. Some of these issues here, for instance, this is one I know that you guys are particularly concerned about on either side of the discussion up here, but all of these issues are issues that are really being driven to the cusp by where we are right now with science and technology, and they are all big political issues that we're currently having a tough time working our way through because of the implications that they pose for our economy or our moral and ethical systems. In fact, over the next 40 years, we will create, with these new scientists, this new science we're doing, as much new knowledge as we've created in the last 400 years. So think about some of the big challenges that we've had. For instance, things like whether or not the Earth goes around the sun 400 years ago, whether or not we should be able to control the human life cycle. Back in the 70s, talk about test tube babies, things like that. All of these are big political discussions that we tend to get mired in because of the type of political system that we have and because of the science-democracy gap. So we can expect that gap in those types of discussions to get more intense over the coming decades. Now, in 2008, some of us noticed this really beginning to play out in presidential politics in a large way for the first time. In fact, when all of these big science issues like climate change were on the docket, no matter which side of each of these debates you're on, we noticed that these top 5 TV news anchors at the time from the major networks had asked the candidates almost 3,000 questions, all the candidates who were running for president at the time. How many do you suppose mentioned the words global warming or climate change? Just as an example, because it was the biggest political science issue.
12.
12? Anybody else? 0? Some of you are pretty darn cynical. 6. There's an optimist, 133. 6. Now just to put that in perspective, there were 3 questions about UFOs. So that's the relative level of importance the National Press Corps and the general news media, people at the top of our American news media system, were putting on the biggest science and economic question really ever to face government. And that's a problem in this day and age. And then think about all the other questions that were in that list. Climate change was just one of them. So we are really facing this unprecedented situation. What we did in 2008 and again in 2012 is to create the U.S. Presidential Science Debates at sciencedebate.org, which was a big initiative that I was lucky enough to be one of the co-founders of. And we brought together the National Academies of Science, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Council on Competitiveness, and then we called for a presidential science debate by reaching out to science bloggers and science writers and scientists that we knew. And it went viral. And before we knew it, within a few weeks, we had 39,000 signers of this initiative, including the presidents of most major universities, the CEOs of a lot of tech corporations, a lot of members of Congress. But we couldn't get the candidates to engage with us until we almost forced them into it. We still wouldn't get them to do it on television, but they did do an online debate. And finally, in 2012, of course, then we had a precedent, so we were more able to get President Obama and Governor Romney to repeat that initiative and let the public know where they stand. The media didn't really think anybody would be interested in this, but as it turned out, we started getting coverage after that, and it snowballed, and we made about 1 billion media impressions, which really helped the public discern where, for instance, Governor Romney stood on climate change. That was a big question that he answered a few days before the RNC, and then it made big news when he shifted his position again at the RNC, talking about how President Obama wanted to heal the planet and slow the rise of the oceans, and he would just look out for you and your family. So we are making progress. There are a lot of scientists that are actually working in other ways to make progress, to rebuild their communication muscles, which have atrophied over the last 2 generations. And we can go into why that may be. But all of these outlets wound up covering Science Debate, the Science Debate Initiative, and got people thinking and talking about these very complicated issues that our elected leaders really need to be able to tackle, because these issues are affecting every aspect of life today. So, oh yeah, and in addition to that, then in 2008, President Obama used our mission statement, Restore Science to its Rightful Place, in his inauguration speech. And he appointed some of our early supporters to top positions in his cabinet. Here's John Holdren, who is still the Presidential Science Advisor, who is one of our earliest advocates. Steve Chu, who was Energy Secretary for about 4 years, physicist who was an early advocate. Jane Lubchenco, who ran NOAA, which is the chief, basically it's the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. And they deal a lot with the climate change issue. Harold Varmus, who runs the National Cancer Institute, and Minnesota's own Marcia McNutt, who runs the U.S. Geological Survey. So this was just 6 people getting together, emailing each other about this idea, and we wound up changing the way that the country thinks and talks about science. So the people in this room are more than enough to change the world. Just think about that. Now, the problem, though, is elected leaders are increasingly not up to this task. Here's Congress. They're hard at work on their laptops there. Now, how many members, I don't know if you can see that, but how many members of Congress do you suppose have a professional background in science? More cynics. More cynics. 3. Okay, it's 9. Come on. But it's still less than 2%. There's a microbiologist, 2 physicists, and 6 engineers, and one of those physicists is actually not running again. He's retiring at the end of this cycle. By contrast, how many lawyers do you suppose there are?
The rest.
Yeah, almost the rest. 226. 226. So it's really little wonder that we've seen more rhetoric-driven argumentation going on in Congress than we've seen knowledge-driven discussion. Why is that a problem? Because as the attorneys in the room will know, when you're making that kind of argument, you have a predetermined conclusion that you are trying to convince others of. And particularly an impartial third party, whether it be a judge, a jury, or in the case of Congress, the body as a whole. You make the most compelling and persuasive argument that you can, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you are always the one to lay out all the facts. And that becomes an issue when we have big, complex problems, social problems, political problems that have large inputs from science, which is the way that most of our issues are today. So what do we do? Well, first of all, we have to understand where we're vulnerable in democracy because of science. Now, Arthur C. Clarke once said, sufficiently advanced science is indistinguishable from magic. And many of us in the room have one of these in our pocket today. Right? Can any of you make one if you broke it? No, probably not. You can't sit at your kitchen table and make these because it requires advanced robotics to even begin to see to do it. So for many of these people, all they know is that it works, and it's essentially equal concepts here, right? Harry Potter flying around. Oh, there he is. And your iPhone. So when technology and science becomes indistinguishable from magic, though, then it becomes more of a matter of belief. And that's the issue right now. For instance, and here's more of a Democrat-leaning anti-science issue. Democrats are often, and liberals are often concerned about unseen dangers to health and the environment. For instance, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors voted in 2011, 11 to 1, or 10 to 1, they were all Democrats, to require every cell phone shop in San Francisco to warn you that your cell phone may give you brain cancer. That is an example of bad policy because it was not based on the science, it was based on fear, worry that that may be true without any real compelling evidence that it is. In fact, those of us who know about a little bit about physics, a little bit about biology, a little bit about chemistry can tell you why that's really impossible for your cell phone to give you brain cancer. And yet, in 2011, the World Health Organization issued a report saying this could be true, that they discovered a statistical blip that showed that maybe your cell phone might give you brain cancer. This is epidemiology at work. What they didn't say, and I was really shocked when I read the report because I looked at the footnote where they referenced that, the statistical blip that they had found was indistinguishable from chance, statistically. It was below the noise level. And yet they were issuing this big headline. They got a lot of news. They got some contributions. And they made worldwide discussion about it. But it really was not science-based. Microwaves have less energy than our skin. Here's the electromagnetic scale. And you'll see that microwaves are down here. They have a little bit more energy than radio waves. They're about as long or as big in their wavelength as a bumblebee or as a pea. Things that are about that size, a little bigger than a pea. But infrared has more energy than microwave. Every one of us sitting in this room is giving off infrared radiation with our bodies. Each of us are emitting about 70, 80 watts right now in infrared. Far more energy than your cell phone is giving off when it's being used. Visible light has far more energy than infrared. It's not until you get all the way up to the bottom end of ultraviolet light, the top end of visible light, that a photon is traveling fast enough with enough energy to knock an electron out of a carbon atom, ionizing it, changing its ability to bond chemically, and therefore altering your DNA and potentially causing cancer if that replicates. But that's 1,000,000 times the energy. So if you compare that, for instance, to being hit by a pea from a pea shooter at 30 miles an hour, to being hit by a bee, is it a Z4 that?
Z3.
Z3? Okay,
yes.
yeah. That's about a pea is about 1.4 grams. Those Z4s, Z3s, they're about 1,400 kilograms. So that's the comparable difference. Yeah, I wouldn't want to get hit by a beamer, but I wouldn't mind getting hit by a pea. But that's when we can't tell the scale, that's when we get confused. And that's when it becomes a matter of belief. And I've already talked about San Francisco. Now take one from the other side of the political divide that we've got going on in the country right now. And that's the second example about how corporations undermine science. For instance, here's some data. You know, we've heard that climate change, you know, maybe it's real, maybe it's not real. It really is real, and I'll show you a little bit of data that supports that from the science. Here's something called the Arctic sea ice extent. This is measured every year, every month, but everybody always looks at the September data because that's when ice coverage in the Arctic is at its lowest ebb. And you'll see that it's been falling and falling and falling. Why is that an issue? Because as there's less ice up in the Arctic, it reflects less light. It changes the Earth's albedo is the term. And as there is less reflectivity at the top of the planet, that darker ocean water absorbs more energy. So suddenly we will expect, and we are seeing, much more rapid changes in the Arctic than we are in other parts of the planet just because of that very sudden change in the reflectivity. Now if we isolate that information, we pop it out and we invert it, we could call it the Arctic open water extent. Same thing, inverse function, right? Now when we do that, we can start comparing it to other measurements that we've been making. For instance, here are declared federal disasters by year. And notice how that's following a somewhat similar arc. Okay, then we overlay that with the global land-ocean temperature index. This is the overall average of ocean and land temperatures measured by satellites and confirmed by thousands of stations on Earth. And that's following a similar arc. In fact, you can overlay that then with the Keeling curve, which is the measurement of atmospheric carbon dioxide, which forms almost a trend line right through the middle of those other arcs, doesn't it? Now the Keeling curve, you'll see it goes up and down and up and down and up and down. Why is that? Does anybody know? We get more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in the winter and spring, essentially. I mean, it's not really, doesn't line up. It's like part of the fall, the winter, and the early spring. When plants have died off, they're decaying and they're emitting their carbon back into the atmosphere. And then in the spring and summer, the atmospheric carbon dioxide falls again as plants start to grow and soak more of that up. So we see this up and down and up and down. But what Keeling observed when he started measuring this in the 50s was that every year, month over month, it was a little bit higher than the year before. And that's when scientists started worrying about what effect humans might be having with that hypothesis. And tens of thousands of scientists began studying it over the last 50 years and came up with millions of data points, actually billions of data points now that show that that is in fact what is happening. So we pop that out, look at the Keeling curve, we overlay that, and this is where it gets into politics and policy. We overlay that, for instance, with insurance losses over the same period of time. Now, there's a group called Munich RE, and what they do is they keep track of, they're a reinsurer of U.S. and property and casualty companies. And what they do is they keep track of the types of losses that we have. Down at the red on the bottom, those are geophysical losses, things like earthquakes and tsunamis. You notice that there's a little bit of variation there. But these other categories, meteorological, storms, that's the green. Hydrological, which is floods and mass movement of water, and climatological, which is temperature extremes, either extreme heat or extreme cold, and droughts and wildfire. All of those factors are predicted to increase with climate change, and sure enough, they're up by 400% in the last 30 years alone. And this isn't increases in the dollar value of losses, this is just increases in the number of events. And this is where it starts to get very political. So I'm going to show you exactly how climate change really was politicized starting in 2009 when President Obama made his challenge to Congress. And I'll take you step by step through exactly how people who have an ideological or economic agenda can twist science for their own ends, and maybe you'll start to recognize the pattern.
I ask this Congress to send me legislation that places a market-based cap on carbon pollution and drives the production of more renewable energy in America.
And sure enough, Congress did a few months later with 8 Republican votes.
The bill is passed.
But what happened immediately after that is Americans for Prosperity, which is funded by Charles and David Koch, in large part, got very busy in politics on this issue.
I'm Tim Phillips, president of Americans for Prosperity. We're here in Billings, Montana.
We certainly did TV ads, radio ads, social media. We did rallies, events. We launched something we called Hot Air.
And we're sending a message to Senator Baucus and Senator Tester to vote no on this job-killing, tax-increasing cap and trade.
We got a hot air balloon, put a banner on the side of it that said cap and trade means higher taxes, lost jobs, less freedom. And we went all over the country doing events and stirring up grassroots anger and frustration, concern.
Cap and trade will slow the economy and cost American jobs.
Jobs, 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 right? Sound familiar? Americans for Prosperity teamed up with the Cato Institute then, and they're delivering this message into the districts of particularly senators that were running in tough districts, and in the districts of those 8 Republicans. They targeted them with Tea Party primary opponents to try to take them out, to punish them and to scare everyone else. At the same time that they were working in their districts, they had their spin artists testifying in congressional committees.
The right response to the non-problem of global warming, next slide please, is to have the courage to do nothing. But the fear of catastrophic man-made global warming is mistaken.
This demonstration shows that the oft-repeated mantra in Washington, quote, "the science is settled," is not true at all.
Not one of those people has any background in science whatsoever. At the same time, a guy that I see on the road sometimes, who in his first part of his career he spent denying that cigarettes caused cancer, and now he's working on the climate issue, hit the road to spread disinformation. He gets paid by Americans for Prosperity, the Heartland Institute, people like that.
Okay, but there hasn't been any perceptible trend. In the last 10 years, there hasn't been any warming. We don't know why that is, but one doesn't see any warming in the observations.
Now Fred is very credible. He comes out very credible, this nice grandfatherly, calm, measured tone. You know, likable seeming guy, very serious. And you can believe him when he says that. The only problem is that he's playing with the numbers on purpose. And Gavin Schmidt, who's a NASA scientist on climate change, climatologist, will explain exactly how.
You could take the entire climate history that we have in the instrumental record, and you could find cooling trends every 10 years.
Cooling trends between 1958 and 1969, 1969 and 1978, 1978 and 1987, and so on. Scientists have a name for this. They call it going down the up escalator.
You pick the endpoints, and you could find any particular year as part of a cooling year. But actually, the whole thing has been moving up.
If you look at all of the data, it's quite clear that the warming is continuing.
So it's really important, really critical when you hear these kinds of statements to always be skeptical about them, because it's very easy with statistics, which science totally relies on, because science is not about what's true or false. It's only about what's most probably true based on our observations and measurements. So we always use statistics. And you can fool yourself or you can fool other people with statistics just by limiting your data set like that to support any argument you want. Then they wound up, as I said, going after those 8 Republicans in their seats. Bob was a very good supporter of science and science debate, and watch what happened to him.
Now, how many times has an incumbent who isn't in prison or facing a prison sentence lost his own primary by 79 to 21%? This was overwhelming. But what's happened is
the smile on your face suggests, man, we won one.
Of course we won one.
We're on the record
and our grandchildren or great-grandchildren are going to read.
This climate hearing in the lame duck Congress was Inglis's last.
Your child is sick. 98 doctors say treat him this way. 2 say no, this other is the way to go. I'll go with the 2. You're taking a big risk for those kids.
There was a very key factor in 10 to 15 congressional districts in the 2010 election where strong supporters of climate change legislation ended up being defeated.
And there's nothing like a loss in an election to promote fear in the survivors. And that's exactly what happened in the United States Congress.
And I want you to think about that, because any science and politically contentious issue faces these same kind of challenges from largely corporations who are protecting their vested economic interests, and they find the weakest point to challenge a political candidate, and candidates like Rebecca Otto, who have the courage to stand up and say, wait a minute, I'm going to vote with integrity on this, do so at the risk of their political future. And it makes it very, very difficult for us on a lot of these science policy issues to move the ball forward right now. All right, but then there's government itself, which is also a part of this problem. Government itself generally has been using this advanced technology, particularly big data, to build large data sets through a lot of secret programs on American citizens. And this is an example of the power of knowledge. You know, Francis Bacon said, as we increase in knowledge, so do we increase in power. And there is a great temptation when you have that power at your fingertips to use it. And the question is, and this is a quote from Valerie Plame, the question is where do you draw that line? And this is why accountability and transparency is so absolutely critical. Not to turn this into another promotion for the state auditor, but it's the kind of job that we need, not only at the state level, accountability and transparency, but at the federal level. And we need to empower those people on this issue. And now some of this is playing out in the courts. Whoops. But it's getting to the point where we have to be seriously concerned about our freedom with what we use online. So we've got these different aspects. We've got citizens making policy decisions contrary to science, like the cell phone issue. We've got corporations undermining science to short-circuit democracy. And we've got governments themselves using science technology to spy on and control their own citizens, purportedly to keep the rest of us safe. All of these questions bring up this final one. Are the people still well enough informed to be trusted with their own government? And I like this phrase, or this photo particularly, because the signs work well together, I think. And this guy, remember, is a voter, like millions of other voters, making decisions on all these complex science issues. So you can begin to understand why this is a growing challenge as science becomes more complex, and we are not seeing a similar evolution in our democracy, in our process of government. Sorry, I got that slide in there twice and forgot. Maybe I was just trying to emphasize the point. All right, so here's one of those illustrious members of Congress, John Shimkus from Illinois, chairman of the House Subcommittee on Environment and the Economy, holding a hearing on climate change. And as he speaks, watch the gilded scientific report he's got in his hand there.
The earth will end only when God declares its time to be over. Man will not destroy this earth. This earth will not be destroyed by a flood. And I appreciate having panelists here who are men of faith, and we can get into the theological discourse of that position. But I do believe God's word is infallible, unchanging, perfect. Two other issues, Mr. Chairman. Today we have about 388 parts per million in the atmosphere. I think in the age of the dinosaurs, where we had most flora and fauna, we were probably at 4,000 parts per million. There is a theological debate that this is a carbon starved planet.
Now, it's always hard for me to know where to begin with, Representative Shimkus. There's so many different entry points. First, you know, my dad read us the Bible over dinner for about a year when I was a kid, and maybe I just missed it, wasn't paying attention, but I don't remember anything about carbon in the Bible. So I'm not sure which theological debate he's referring to. But the larger issue that I'm concerned about is that this is really the exact opposite of the kind of thinking that I think that Thomas Jefferson had in mind. And when we're talking about a data-based, a science-informed issue, turning to a book, no matter how great the book is, that was written several thousand years ago when we didn't have the precision of measurement that we do now, probably is not going to get us where we need, and may not be appropriate in these cases. Here's another fellow, a medical doctor who sits on the House Science and Technology Policy Committee, who thinks that science now is lies straight from the pit of hell.
God's word is true. I've come to understand that. All that stuff I was taught about evolution and embryology and Big Bang Theory, all that is lies straight from the pit of hell. And it's lies to try to keep me and all the folks who are taught that from understanding that they need a Savior. You see, there are a lot of scientific data that I found out as a scientist that actually show that this is really a young Earth. I don't believe that the Earth is about 9,000 years old. I believe it was created in 6 days as we know them. That's what the Bible says. And what I've come to learn is that it's the manufacturer's handbook, is what I call it. It teaches us how to run our lives individually, how to run our families, how to run our churches. But it teaches us how to run all of public policy and everything in society. And that's the reason as your congressman, I hold the Holy Bible as being the major directions to me of how I vote in Washington, D.C., and I'll continue to do that.
Now again, probably the opposite of what Jefferson had in mind. How could this be that people like these don't lose their jobs? There was a time when making these kind of comments would have been the end of a political career. What has happened in American culture where not only is it not the end of a career, but often these people are celebrated? I would suggest it's because science has grown so complicated that it is a matter of belief. And if it is a matter of belief, and we have competing belief systems, then what's to say that this one isn't just as valid? At least that's the way that the thinking goes. And that's where we can tend to get into trouble. In fact, here's how some of that trouble can materialize in policy challenges at the national level. Speaker Boehner is the second most powerful man in the US government by a lot of measures, most notably because he controls the flow of money through Congress. Here he is making an earnest point about climate change on national television.
We have to deal with this in a responsible way. So what is the responsible way? That's my question. What is the Republican plan to deal with carbon emissions, which every major scientific organization has said is contributing to climate change?
George, the idea that carbon dioxide is a carcinogen that is harmful to our environment is almost comical.
Yes, he's right. It is almost comical.
We actually have carbon dioxide. Every cow in the world, you know, when they do what they do, you've got more carbon dioxide.
All right. I don't know about you, but I didn't realize that cows farted carbon dioxide. But with the level of understanding that the speaker has of this issue, I mean, he's not making fun here. He's trying to answer the question seriously. With the level of understanding that he has, how can we begin to think about getting policy issues driven by complicated science through the House, getting anything funded, getting anything through Congress ultimately? And that's the rub. And we're experiencing that rub in Minnesota in a number of ways as well.
There's a woman who came up crying to me tonight after the debate. She said her daughter was given that vaccine. She told me her daughter suffered mental retardation as a result of that vaccine. There are very dangerous consequences. It's not good enough to take, quote, a mulligan where you want a do-over, not when you have little children's lives at risk.
Man-made global warming is poppycock. I hope I can say that on your show.
You know you can.
In other words, I don't believe in it. Look, if people look at the real data, the climate has varied ever since we have known that the planet was here. And we know that those scientists who tried to concoct the science to say that we had a hockey stick global warming and they were busted because they manipulated the data. No. If man-made global warming is not a crisis.
Now, this is interesting because, by the way, these two are Minnesota's contributions to the presidential discussion last time. Thank you very much. Herman Cain was a well-respected businessman, actually, in Minneapolis, who wound up buying Godfather's Pizza. He was running it for Pillsbury, and then he wound up taking it private, buying it for $100 million. He was super well-respected. And yet, here he is making ridiculous statements on a national radio program. What is driving an otherwise intelligent person to have to say this kind of thing?
For evolution to explain the creation of the human species from nothing to human beings, absolutely not. I don't believe in that. HPV, forcing 12-year-old girls,
another medical doctor, by the way,
to prevent this sexually transmitted disease. This is not good medicine. I do not believe. I think it's social misfit, and not
But I'm opposed to getting involved in the process of killing children in order to have research in children. And I think you're finding, you look at what's happening with stem cell research, we have less and less demand that you have anything except regular stem cells because we're learning how to use them.
Now, I just don't remember headlines about children being killed for that medical research. Newt is an interesting example because Newt told me in 2008, I'll do anything I can to support science, and he signed on to the Science Debate Initiative. And he has done some good things, as the language I put up there describes, for science. But at the same time, he cut the budget of the Office of Technology Assessment, which was Congress's science advisory body that gave them nonpartisan information, and now they rely on lobbyists in the internet. Fortunately, lobbyists in the internet always tell the truth, so we probably didn't need it anyway, right? But here he was at an ebb in his campaign, and he was looking for some way to get the activists charged up. And what did he do? He trotted out some kind of anti-science statement, which is what all these other candidates were doing at low spots in their campaign. So it actually gave them a little bit of a bounce.
You yourself have said the party is in danger of becoming anti-science. Who on the stage is anti-science? Listen, when you make comments that fly in the face of what 98 out of 100 climate scientists have said, when you call into question the science of evolution, all I am saying is that in order for the Republican Party to win, we can't run from science.
Finally, we've got a sane one here. How did it work out for him? He immediately plummeted in the polls and finished last in the next primary right after making that comment in Florida in 2011.
Governor Huntsman was not specific about names, but the two of you do have a difference of opinion about climate change. Just recently in New Hampshire, you said that weekly or even daily, scientists are coming forward to question the idea that human activity is behind climate change. Which scientists have you found most credible on this subject?
Well, I do agree that the science is not settled on this. The idea that we would put Americans' economy at jeopardy based on scientific theory that's not settled yet, to me is nonsense. I mean, and I tell somebody, I said, just because you have a group of scientists that stood up and said, here is the fact, Galileo got outvoted for a spell.
Right, by people like him. I think he's got it backwards.
I don't speak for the scientific community, of course, but I believe the world will get warmer. I can't prove that, but I believe, based on what I read, that the world is getting warmer. And number two, I believe that humans contribute to that.
Now, on this one I put pre-Rush Romney for a reason. This is Governor Romney at the first town hall forum that he held after announcing his candidacy for president. And the first question he was asked was about climate change, and this was his answer. Then 4 days later, Rush Limbaugh went on his radio show, and this is what he said about that answer.
Bye-bye nomination. Bye-bye nomination, Otto and down. We're in the midst here of discovering if this is all a hoax. The last year has established that the whole premise of man-made global warming is a hoax.
So here we have an authority figure of sorts, because people listen to him all the time, saying that it's a hoax, and wanting the nomination, the governor felt a need to adjust his rhetoric. So 6 months later, in November of that year, here's what he was saying.
My view is that we don't know what's causing climate change on this planet, and the idea of spending trillions and trillions of dollars to try and reduce CO2 emissions is not the right course for us.
So this really highlights the problem in one person, and it shows the tragedy of the situation of what's going on right now in our government. When we have a situation where all the science points in one direction, and where the vast amount of people know that that's what's going on, but we're seeing a lot of disinformation spread, and politicians are required to toe somebody else's line. This isn't just happening in Congress or in the run for president. It's also happening in local governments, future members of Congress. Here is when North Carolina banned sea level rise, for instance. They didn't like it that scientists had said that the sea level was rising, so they forbid local governments from passing building regulations that took that into account, or from taking it into account when they were building roads, for instance, or permitting new buildings. In fact, they had to, and this is really reminiscent more of Mao's China than the United States, they had to seek permission from the state government before they did that. And they could only use the numbers, the official numbers, that the state legislature had approved, instead of what science actually said. So an example of the ultimate triumph of politics over science, or of ideology over science. So what is going on? Have people just gotten dumb? Not really. Here's an example from the right. If you ask non-college educated Republicans if they think that humans are causing climate change, 31 say yes. By the time they get through college, that number drops to 19%. With more education, the number of people who actually look at the science falls. So what could be happening here? Scientists often think that, you know, they just don't know, we just got to give them more education. That's not the answer. Let's take a look at it on the left. I don't have a chart for that one, but Seth Mukin, author of The Panic Virus, talks about this. How liberal, educated Whole Food shoppers are much more likely to be vaccine refusers because of the false belief that vaccines cause autism. Same effect. As people's education and financial circumstances increase, the level of denial of science along party lines tends to increase. What could be happening? I think that what's happening, and there isn't yet a lot of science on this, but I think that's what's happening is with increased education, people become more critical, more skeptical. But the problem is then instead of following that through and basing it on knowledge or data, they base it on slanted sources. So they're questioning government, scientists, authority. That's a good thing in America. But they're not making sound decisions. They aren't following through. Here's another example from Minnesota. This is the very friendly sounding Vaccine Safety Council of Minnesota. This is a letter that they sent to the Minnesota Book Awards when my book was up for consideration. Down here at the bottom, we respectfully request that this book be removed from consideration, because I talk about how vaccines don't cause autism. So, and these people, by the way, were every bit as vicious to deal with as the climate deniers that I deal with on a regular basis. I always say Twitter's for fighting. And that's where a lot of climate deniers hang out, and I do some gladiatorial battles with them. So how is this possible? I just want to give you an overview of what happened with our science politics in America. You'll notice two lines here are red and blue, and that's not by accident. About 100, 110, 115 years ago, science was really a source of national pride as new discoveries were quickly commercialized, and a lot of people made money, and the middle class exploded because of that. But then around the middle of the last century, as we dropped the bomb, the public's feeling about science really became ambivalent. We had a lot of doubt. There was a lot of moral questioning about whether science had outgrown our moral and ethical capacity. And then that doubt turned to fear in 1957 when the Soviets launched Sputnik. It was about the size of a beach ball, but it showed that they could perhaps put a bomb in space also, an atomic bomb. They don't have to be that big. And then drop it on us. And that created a considerable fear and set off a science race and a space race, right? And suddenly science was really funded in a way that by the government that it had never been funded before. The NSF got funding, and they were setting up policies and procedures for which scientists, how do you know you'd be funding good science? You have to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars. Well, you have to have scientists judge that to see if proposals, grant proposals, make sense and if they're good science or not. But the problem is that we didn't think about what that would do, because before that, scientists had to appeal to the public. They would hold, it had been Hubble, would hold standing room only conversations about his latest discoveries. 5,000 people crowding big auditoriums to listen to him talk. All that went away because scientists just had to impress each other now with their grant proposals. And suddenly, scientists began to look at politics and at public engagement as something that would harm their objectivity, that was beneath them, that was dirty somehow. And scientists that engaged in that, for instance, there's this thing called the Sagan effect for Carl Sagan. And, you know, he was denied admission to the National Academy of Sciences because people said his scientific contributions weren't that great. But the people who did that had always also talked about how they were jealous of him and thought that he was really was sinking to a low level. In fact, Sagan he published an article pretty much every month through his entire 31-year career as a scientist. He's one of the most productive scientists, and there's science now that shows that scientists that do engage in the public also tend to be more productive as scientists. So we had this silence that happened in the public conversation around science, and then all of a sudden we had two factors that changed the whole conversation politically and got us to where we are now. In 1962, Rachel Carson published her book, Silent Spring, which was the creation of really the environmental science and environmental movement at the same time. Corporations, particularly chemical and petrochemical, they really mounted vilification campaigns and began to perfect a lot of the efforts that are in use today to attack science and scientists. And then about 10 years later, we had big advances in not only throughout the next 10 years in birth control, but then the idea of in vitro fertilization suddenly became possible. And we had a big debate about test tube babies, as we called them at the time. And religious conservatives were then worried about whether or not they would have souls. So far, the several million that are born in the United States do seem to be fairly similar to the rest of us. But what happened in this split over environmental and biological sciences caused a real political split in US politics. So we see on one side old industry that is offended economically by these advances, and old religion that is offended ideologically by these advances. And on the other side we see science and environmentalists. And that's why the divide is actually kind of interesting up here, because it doesn't necessarily follow that same rubric, but generally speaking in the country it does. So on the right you see the idea of creeping socialism. That's what they constantly talk about, how science is trying to socialize government and control your behavior. And their anti-science tends to be denying climate change, or it tends to be about evolution or about reproductive issues. On the left it's about hidden dangers, the unfounded suspicion that corporations or technology or things you eat or ingest might be bad for you or might be bad for the environment. And this gets a little fuzzy because a lot of times they are, but that doesn't mean that they always are. And the left gets confused because they ball that up with kind of a holistic, almost religion, and stop thinking. And then it also becomes a values issue. And so suddenly we see ideas like, for instance, EMF pollution from from radio waves could cause cancer, or that fluoride in water, that was Jesse Ventura's thing, but people on the left tend to believe that fluoride is put in water to make you docile, or that GMO crops, which have some very serious ethical and economic issues, but the argument that they're bad to eat, the science doesn't support that. Or that cell phones cause brain cancer, or that vaccines cause autism. So we see kind of the hidden dangers meme on the left. On the right, the motivation is about anti-regulation and anti-reproductive control and pro-corporate. You know, someone recently said, objections to regulation have been around as long as government, right? Because that's what government is really doing. It regulates our lives so we can live orderly in society. And the motivation on the left is pro-environment, pro-choice, and anti-corporate. Does this sound familiar now? It's kind of where a lot of our discussions tend to revolve around. It's around the split in science. So the theme on the right is liberal scientists with a socialist agenda want to control your life and limit your freedom. And on the left, it's impersonal doctors, greedy corporations, and mechanistic scientists hide the real dangers to health, the environment, and our spirits. The interesting thing about this is most of this discussion has happened without the input from scientists. It's all been happening in the culture. But it describes much of our politics today. Why is this a problem? Thomas Jefferson envisioned this virtuous circle of democracy. You have a governance issue, some problem that you have to solve. You go out to the educated and informed mass of the people, he called them. When they are educated and informed, and it requires no real great degree of education, they can be trusted with their own government. Then those people, through Congress or through the government, commission scientific research to build knowledge about that policy issue, to decide what is the right thing to do. And finally, based on that knowledge, we debate the best policy, right? That seems reasonable. That's the way it should work. What's happening right now is that we wind up seeing vested interests that spend a great deal on propaganda and on sending and on creating alternative theories for children in school. For instance, they create ideas of intelligent design in schoolrooms. And then when we do that, instead of turning to scientific research, all of a sudden we're going to be turning to authority and ideology for that knowledge. And what happens when we do that? Well, then instead of debating the best policy based on knowledge, we debate the best policy based on dogma, just as Representative Shimkus was when he was waving his gilded Bible around in that technical committee hearing on climate change. So what is this really a recipe for? The transformation of democracy to authoritarianism. And that's really what it's about. And if you think about Maoist China, you think about the Soviet Union back in the day, you think about Nazi Germany, that's the cycle that they had going. That's the cycle of an authoritarian government. And that's why this is so serious, and that's why the advance of science is posing such a challenge for democracy. There are two choices for us. We can step up the level of education and communication, or we can find a new form of government, really. Because ultimately we're going to lose control of it. And we're teetering very close to that right now in a lot of ways. So how do we get adults to make good decisions then? Well, we need to really have we're relying on the press, right? That was freedom of the press, Thomas Jefferson's idea there. Well, let's see how that's going for us. And I'm almost done, by the way, for those who are nervous about where we're at on time. All right, so in journalism, there's always two sides to every story. You hear that all the time, right? Bob says 2 + 2 is 4, Julie says it's 6, the controversy rages. I think Julie's right. What about you guys? Right? I'll make that assertion right now, and then somebody's going to want to argue with that.
Let's compromise.
Yes, right. Well, we're getting there. Science says most times one side is simply wrong, right? I can show you with these apples that Bob is clearly right, all right? So we've got knowledge input on this, objective knowledge input. That's objective, right, apples? From science. So we can show that Bob is right. But then we get politics, right? How about a compromise? Steve's point. And so we pass a new law on the issue, right? And then everybody's happy, right? That's kind of our American political system in a nutshell right now. And that's where we're running into problems. But the issue is that this false balance, this idea that we put, a split screen, imagine that. On one side you have a scientist who is speaking, representing the point of view of science based on the accumulated knowledge from thousands or tens of thousands of experiments conducted by hundreds or thousands of scientists that have all been trying to tear down every little advance and haven't been able to. And that's what that scientist is talking about. And on the other side of the screen, you have somebody who is trying to convince you of their predetermined conclusion, and they're making the most persuasive, rhetorical, legalistic type argument that they can. Why is that a problem? It tends to discount those science-based arguments. It discounts the role of knowledge, and it presents it as if it's just another opinion, instead of giving adequate weight to it, which is why it's called false balance. I was just talking to Don Shelby about this, and he counsels young journalists about this all the time. He says, balance doesn't mean give equal representation to both sides. It means go with the weight of the evidence and present the side that has all the weight of the evidence, or most of the weight of the evidence, on its side. Then you're doing a balanced story. So we have a problem in our journalism schools right now, and it does have costly consequences. David Gregory, for instance, he was asked, how come, he was in the White House press corps at the time of our getting into the Iraq War, and he was asked afterwards, how come none of you people in the White House press corps pushed the administration on any lack of credible evidence for going into Iraq? And he said, I respectfully disagree, that's not our role. But it's not the role of journalists in a democracy to provide that feedback loop through the public, that rudder to keep democracy in check. Whose role is it, and what is their role? How will democracy continue to function? And that's the problem with our journalists today. In fact, they are goofed up in a lot of ways on this idea of science and democracy. Something happened in their training starting about 20 years ago that confused them, and we see it all over. There is no such thing as objectivity. Here's the new reporter guidelines for the Voice of San Diego, but this is just one example, not to pick on them. They're an otherwise fine publication. But if you believe that there's no such thing as objectivity, you're not going to dig to get at the truth, especially when an issue has a big input from science, because there is objectivity there. Science is all about objectivity. It's about shearing away our political identity, our gender identity, our biases, our beliefs, our emotions, our wishes, our religious identity, and finding out from all of that what is the nugget that is actually replicable, that's true over and over, and we call that knowledge. There is objectivity. Linda Ellerby, here she is again. We report the news, not truth. There's no such thing as objectivity. In fact, the cancer is so bad that even objectivists, here we go. Ed Gillespie, or I'm sorry, yeah, is it Ed Gillespie? Yeah, no, it's Nick Gillespie. Sorry, I get his name confused sometimes. The editor of Reason magazine, the objectivist publication, there is saying there's no such thing as objectivity. If anybody would think that there's objectivity, you'd think it would be an objectivist. So we, in this kind of situation, we really need citizens to hold policymakers and the media accountable. And this is a tough sell, but it's so critically important right now. Those letters to the editor, pushing editors, getting on the phone with them, talking about facts and about objectivity. We need scientists and science journalists to bridge the gap. Religion and jobs don't mean check your brain at the door, right? Science debates can drive this kind of science age discussion. This is really what we need to be able to help the general public, because nobody, not even scientists, have the time to know all that there is in science. So everybody's going to a certain extent on belief. But we need to be able to increase our level of critical thinking around these science issues and be more skeptical. And finally, we need to also fix the broken tenure system, that thing that discourages scientists and professors from doing public outreach, and find a way to encourage them and reward them for that, so that the voice of science is not silent in our political dialogue. Because to arrive at balanced policy, we need all the different perspectives. We need the perspective of religion and ethics, for sure. And we need the perspective of business and economics, for sure. But we also need the perspective of science. And then ultimately, of course, you can always buy the book and an extra one for a friend. So just trying to give you solutions, you know, I don't want to leave you depressed. So Albert Einstein said back in 1948 that everything has changed save our ways of thinking. And that was probably a statement that will ring true forever at this point. And I just want to leave you with this last closing observation about the situation that really sent me down this path.
There
There's an old saying in Tennessee, I know it's in Texas, probably in Tennessee, that says, "Fool me once, shame on you." You fool me, you can't get fooled again.
That's right. No truer words were ever spoken. Thank you all for coming.
I'll take some questions. Okay. The guys will run the mic. I think I felt a lot of high energy brain waves going on in here today. So somebody must have a question. Anybody? Let's start over here.
They don't cause cancer either, by the way.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your book, Shawn. It's one of the best I've ever read.
Thank you.
Talk about
hold it closer to your mouth.
The science being a non-linear pursuit, trial and error, observation, and you compare it to, and I'll always think of this when I see a fox by the road, a pack of hounds chasing a fox, trying out one thing, trial and error, going back, trying another path. What a great analogy.
Thank you.
You want to make a comment about that? That's a good
pretty
comment.
much speaks for itself. That's a great comment. Yes, thank you.
Down the edge here. Anybody? Susan?
I was wondering, is there a country that is kind of doing it right with their education and science, like teaching their kids, or?
There are some, yes, there are some, the question was, well, I guess everybody heard the question. I'm Mike, but all right. Yes, there are some countries that are doing it well. Right is a value judgment, but that where their children really are performing well. For instance, Finland, where I was recently this last summer, they consistently place at the top of the international rankings, as does Taiwan and a couple of other provinces in China. There's a lot of discussion for why that is. In Finland, one big factor, I think, is a lack of diversity. So it's a lot easier to teach everything in one language and to not deal with a lot of cultural issues at the same time, because that adds complications. But the other factor, I think, in all of this is, what can we do with our education to move things forward in this way? And one thing that I tell teachers to do, and if there are any teachers in the room, and if you're still working, try this out. It's really fun, especially if you teach science or if you teach civics, is to try and team teach a unit with a science teacher and a civics teacher and talk about this intersection. And I go in great detail in the book, actually, about the intersection between science and the foundation of America and the foundation of democracy and the ideas that led to America, which were all based on science. And then do a science debate. Pick a contentious or several contentious issues that have big inputs from science, and tell your students that they've got to research both sides, and then flip a coin on the day of to determine which side they'll actually be arguing. And what that does is that teaches them the difference between a persuasive, rhetoric-based argument and a real knowledge-based argument. And they'll get it intrinsically from that process and their competitive instinct to try and win that debate, especially if you have a really cool prize. So that's one good tool to begin to reintegrate this. You know, you say in teaching and education, you always raise their level of concern, right, and make it personal, create cognitive dissonance. That's a good tool to do all three of those.
Nancy?
Could you just briefly describe the problem with the tenure system?
Yes. Well, all right, so in the creation of the NSF, after that creation, the heavy motivation was to win NSF grants. And the idea in many universities grew up that, and was memorialized in university policies, that time spent on public outreach really was something you do at the end of your career when you really weren't productive as a scientist anymore. And when people did that, they were considered in that role then at the end of their career. And as suddenly, if you're doing a lot of work engaging the public and teaching the public, but you're not productive in research, or you're not as productive as they presume that you might be if you weren't spending that time, and there's that presumption there, then all of a sudden, when it's time for tenure, you might be passed up, because the status of a university's science department is determined by the number of NSF grants that you get, or the other government granting agency grants that you get. because that determines how many kids want to go there, for instance, and what their opportunities are, and what your connections are, and how what their chances are for having a career. So the younger generation, interestingly enough, is really starting to get this. There are a lot of, partly because of the economy back in 2007, 2008, 2009, but there are a lot of older scientists that have hung on to their university positions, and there is a huge glut of postdocs right now who can't find jobs in their field and are, you know, flipping burgers or doing whatever they can do outside of their field to make a living. Chances are most of them, the numbers show, won't go back, which is a terrible shame. You have a PhD and you've worked even beyond that and you won't go back. So I guess, you know, that's a very long answer to a very short question, but there are a lot of factors at work. And, oh yes, and a lot of those younger scientists now, they also do become bloggers, science communicators, and we've seen the level of science communication, the quality of it skyrocket. But you have to know where to find it. It's not something that comes at you. You have to go out and search for it. Scienceblogs.com is a really good one. National Geographic has some science blogs. Discover has some science blogs they're all really spectacular. So if there are science issues, I'd encourage you to check them out and go from there, and you can branch out from there.
I think we probably need to get back to work. I appreciate your time and coming up here all this way and
absolutely
and stimulating a lot of great conversation and thought. And the book is a great book. Read it slowly. That's my opinion. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.